Also under this activity, we are collaborating with the EU-funded ClimaMed project, and we are to assist in the implementation of approximately 15 sustainable energy initiatives for those villages and towns that have published or are in the process of completing their sustainable energy and climate action plans, their SECAPs. Last but not least, we are collaborating with our co-applicant, the Lebanon Green Building Council, and we will hopefully roll out, the LGBC will roll out the ERS 2.0 building certification scheme for existing and new commercial sector entities. And LGBC will also assess policy instruments to try to incentivize various institutions to get on board, get certified, and improve their energy, the way they use their energy. And the next activity related to policy, we'll be working on net metering policy like we have in the past. Hopefully when things in Lebanon become better, we will continue working to try to initiate with DL the community net metering and other net metering schemes. And also our main focus of this webinar is to introduce the energy attribute certificate schemes. And this will be left to the speakers to discuss what this means. We'll carry out different capacity building trainings. We will focus on the technologies that we are going to implement, like the biogas, the concentrated solar thermal, the energy efficiency, the ERS rating system, and so on. We're going to set up some practical face-to-face trainings if possible, or online. We have special attention to be placed on scholars, professionals, and university students. I would like just to mention now just a few things on the subject of energy attribute certificates. And Lebanon has pledged under the Paris Climate Change Agreement to reach a target of 15% of the power and heat demand by 2030 to be generated by renewable energy sources if left by itself, meaning if Lebanon doesn't receive significant international support. A conditional target, if assisted by the international community, Lebanon has pledged to achieve 20% of power and heat demand by 2030. Also, other targets, like the publication by the Ministry of Energy and Water and the LCEC of the National Renewable Energy Action Plan, also indicated that Lebanon can reach 12.5% of its total primary energy demand from renewable energy sources. Last but not least, ARENA, in its latest publication, late last year, indicated in one of its scenarios, the RE map scenario, that Lebanon can achieve 30% of its electricity mix from renewable energy by 2030. We all know so far, due to many circumstances that we are passing through, that the main success factor in renewable energy in Lebanon has been the distributed solar photovoltaic systems. I'm talking about electricity only. And we can see in this graph, in this publication, that year on year, the capacity of distributed solar photovoltaic has been increasing from around 470 kilowatts in 2011 to over 56 megawatts in 2018. Now, what's important is that we can survey the capacity of installations of solar photovoltaic, but do we actually know that these systems being installed are delivering the full power that they are able to actually give or not? So this is a question that should be asked. And to add on that, can EACs play a role to help us measure the actual RE power on an annual basis? Can EACs help us then determine if we are meeting all the targets I just mentioned before in reaching certain targets of renewable energy by 2030? Are there any additional benefits to using EACs? Can we create an EAC market with income being created and exchanged? Hopefully, we will try to get answers from our distinguished speakers in this webinar. Thank you very much for this. This is all I will say, and now we'll probably go to the main event. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I think on the agenda it now passes to me. So I will share my screen, and please let me know if you can see it properly. Is that working for everybody?
We see the presentation style, not the full screen.
Yeah, I can do that. Is that better?
It's the same, unfortunately.
Oh, 1 second. Okay, I'll reshare.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared. Okay, so as I was introduced earlier on, I'm Adam White, Director of REX International. I'll give a quick overview of the organization REX International. We are an industry association representing all users of guarantees of origin across the value chain of energy, particularly focused on the European Union and the European single market. We engage with our members and we run events every year, including a large annual conference, which we run in collaboration with the IREX standard, which this year will be in September in Amsterdam. We look forward to hopefully being able to welcome people in person then after a long time of working from home. We do a lot of communications work and coordination work. We obviously engage with the regulatory affairs at EU level and at national level in European Union member states. And also we look to the future with issues like disclosure and the internationalization of tracking renewable energy. You can find a lot more information on our website that you see below, or indeed by contacting me directly, and I'd be happy to engage with any of you bilaterally. So this is the presentation I'm going to give. I'll go over a bit of the how and why of EAC schemes. I'll just touch on the different schemes around the world before the other speakers look at the IREX standard in more detail. I'll speak about REX International's guidance on EAC schemes, and particularly how consumers can maximize the reliability and impact of their purchasing. Then I'll go into a bit of a deep dive on European GEOs with a case study. This is because the European Union was the first kind of market area to really establish a legal basis for energy attribute tracking. Even though the idea of certifying the attributes of energy and selling them started in the US, the EU was the first place to really codify that. And then I'll speak a bit about the role of reporting standards in EAC schemes. So the how and why of EAC schemes, just to really start at the most basic level to make sure we're all on the same page. Basically, this is how the electricity system works. You have electricity sources and generators who put charge onto the grid. That grid is maintained and balanced by the system operators. And then you have end users that take charge off the grid. And in a traditional scheme where there's no certificates, it's impossible to track the energy from generator to user because, as I said, it's simply the charge that's loaded onto the grid. The grid is maintained in balance, and then charge is taken off the grid by end users. So that would be a traditional scheme with no certification. Then you can have a scheme where there is certification of some sources of energy. Typically, that would be renewable energy. So in this case, you can see that a portion of the electricity on the grid has been certified and can be tracked. And then a portion of end users can buy those certificates, cancel them, and in cancelling them, claim the use of that proportion of energy. So that is a partially tracked scheme. And that's, for example, what we run in most European countries at the moment. The progression of that is to move to what's called a full disclosure scheme. This is where all sources of energy generation are certified. They're issued with certificates. Those certificates can be sold in a market to end users, and then all end users know exactly where the energy, in this case electricity, they are using comes from. We particularly support full disclosure because for two reasons. We think when only renewable energy is certified, then there's kind of an extra step that buyers of renewable energy have to go through to prove that that's what they're buying by purchasing the certificates and cancelling them to make the claims that they want to make. So that's it's important for us that all energy sources should be on a level playing field. And the other is that it allows consumers to both make claims, both make positive choices in favor of renewable energy, but also say, well, I don't want another particular source of energy. I don't want any nuclear in my mix, or I don't want any coal in my mix. And being conscious of where all their energy is coming from, because they can see that on their bills, they can make clearer, more informed choices about where they get their energy from. And our belief is that will be to the benefit of renewable energy. So this is how the certificate market fits in with an energy, in this case, a power market. So obviously we have legislation and regulations that regulate the market. We have the sources of energy, which are then certified by the issuance of a certificate to a generator. The power is traded and the certificate can be traded. They can be traded either together or separately. And they can be sold directly from generator to end user or through a supplier, both on the certificate side and on the power side. And then the end user uses the energy, redeems the certificate by cancelling it, and can make the claim as to what kind of energy they've been using. And that is governed both by the power market rules, but also EAC system standards that we'll get into a bit more detail on later on. And then at the very end of the chain, there are consumer claims standards, which I'll speak about at the end, which are another important part, particularly for large users of renewables who have corporate sustainability standards that they wish to maintain, and they do that by proving the use on the energy side of their energy through the cancellation of certificates. So the final point on why people use EAC schemes and part of the benefit they can give is as well as providing the information, which we maintain is the most important part of an EAC scheme, they can also be an important revenue source for renewable energy. And you see in this chart that obviously any generation type of energy can sell the power that they generate and receive income for that. But renewable energy, particularly in a scheme like we have in the European Union, can also sell the certificates and get a separate income stream for that, which should, in theory, boost the demand for renewable energy and allow renewable energy producers, with the additional income they have, to build more renewable energy and thereby accelerate the transition to a 100% renewable energy system. So looking at EAC schemes around the world, these are the three main schemes. The European Guarantees of Origin market, where I'm focused, is in green in the middle. The North American REC scheme is obviously North America in lighter green. And then the IREC standard, which Jared and Thomas will talk about more, covers a lot of other countries, as you can see in the world. And it's important to know, I think, I'm particularly impressed that they cover all the BRICS countries, which are the leading emerging markets in the world. So just touching on the development of these schemes, you can see this is the North American scheme. It has a number of different issuers and market operators, and it covers all of North America. And it's a market that has grown considerably since 2006 and consistently. And that's something that we see when we look through all of the different markets, this consistent growth, which is driven by more and more demand for renewable energy, particularly on the corporate side. We see that again in IREC countries, which we can see here. Again, IREC countries have a number of different issuers. some of which cover more than one country, some of which cover only one country. And again, Jared can speak on that in more detail. I'll simply say that the IREC standard is relatively new compared to the North American scheme and the European scheme, but it's one that's growing very rapidly, kind of 100% year on year. And we've seen in 2020 over 30 terawatt hours of issuance for IRECs, which is great progress. The European scheme, this European system is governed by EU law, which is then translated into EU member state law. But it's important to point out also that the European countries, and a majority of European countries, all of the ones you see in dark blue, are also members of a voluntary scheme, which is called the European Energy Certificate System rules, and that is run by the Association of Issuing Bodies, which is a umbrella organization of, as I say, the majority of issuing bodies that you see detailed on this map. And that is a scheme that is very developed, very detailed, and runs very effectively in Europe. And the rules of the European Energy Certificate System are being translated more and more into the European legislation and the European standard, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail. And again, in Europe, the growth of the market has been consistent over the last decade or so, with both the supply of renewable energy growing, but particularly the demand, which is shown by the black line of cancelled certificates. That's the demand, and the gap between supply and demand has been reducing over time as well. So demand has been slowly but surely catching up to demand in the European Union. So as I said, these schemes are governed by quite detailed regulations and legislation often, but even with that, there are some choices that renewable energy buyers sometimes face, particularly when they're buying from new or emerging renewable energy markets. And we talk about that in quite a lot of detail in our report on maximizing the reliability and impact of buying renewables. I recommend anyone to read that. It's written in a way that it should hopefully be accessible to both newcomers to the market, but also help to inform people who, market participants who've been operating renewable energy markets for some time. So we speak about in that report the geographic the geographic choices that that buyers have to make, and we recommend that you always buy within the same market as you're consuming wherever possible. We recommend that if you're buying outside of your market, that there is a physical energy connection between the market of your consumption and the market of the generation of the energy you're using. We recommend that consumers buy the certificates from generation that is as close as possible to their consumption. We explain a bit the difference of regulatory surplus and the difference between compliance markets, which are markets where either suppliers or consumers are required to buy or sell a particular percentage of renewable energy. And those principally exist in North America, but it's an option that is available to all markets to have a compliance element to their market as well as a voluntary element, and that's explained in that part of the report. We talk about the different contractual forms of buying renewable energy and point out that none are inherently more impactful than others, but that long-term purchases, longer-term contracts can support renewable energy generators very effectively, particularly where there's less public support for the generation or production of renewable energy. We recommend that all that buyers own all the attributes of their energy, so that the attributes aren't split up between different certificate schemes. We also strongly recommend that anyone introducing a scheme or using a scheme uses a recognized scheme. So that would be one of the schemes I've mentioned here, the IREC, the North American REC, or GOs. And then we support the use of third-party verification through reporting services like the CDP. So that's a quick overview of ways in which consumers and market operators can maximize the reliability and impact of buying renewable energy. So looking in a bit more detail at the European scheme, this is the EU legal framework over time. So we've had 3 renewable energy directives, one in 2001, 2009, and 2018. And over time, this legal framework has increasingly harmonized the rules for using guarantees of origin in the different EU member states, but there are some differences that remain. We're looking at now we're in the implementation period of the latest directive, which provides more and more stringent legal basis for GEOs and more harmonization in the European Union, and that should be fully implemented by the summer of this year. Another form of maximizing harmonization and standardization across the European market for guarantees of origin is a European standard, which is currently being negotiated amongst all stakeholders in GEO schemes, and that should in theory be in place by the end of the implementation period, which I mentioned. And if that is the case, then there should be a large degree of harmonization and standardization between the different markets of the European Union, which make up the European single market. And as I mentioned before, there is also the European Energy Certificate System rules, which are adhered to by, I think, 27 of the now 30 European member states, European single market countries, which is member states plus Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. And that is a very detailed set of rules, and it facilitates not only similarity in the markets, but ease of transfer between member countries of the European Energy Certificate System. So we also support that all European Union countries, all European single market countries adhere to those rules. Another form of kind of standardization in the market, in the European market, is in the form of a number of standard contracts that have been developed. You can see here 3 examples. There's an EFET contract for giving a template for power purchase agreements, which are an important tool, particularly for large consumers. EFET also provides a master agreement for kind of setting the terms of trade for a number of trades of guarantees of origin over time between market participants. And we at REX International have a standard contract, which we're shortly going to publish an update of, which allows for single trades of guarantees of origin. So those are kind of 3 ways in which market participants have common contract forms to facilitate the exchange of guarantees of origin in the European market. And then finally, as I'm just a bit over time, I think it's important to mention the role of reporting standards. These are not based in legislation or regulations, but they are very important, particularly to large consumers, that they are based in a scheme or using certificates which allow them to report their renewable energy use to, for example, the RE100 group, which is a group of companies committed to using 100% renewable energy, or, for example, the CDP, which is another reporting standard which covers more elements than energy, but on energy as well, has rules which consumers have to adhere to if they want to report the use of their renewable energy and have that recognized in the categorization of CDP. And a lot of the companies that do report to those schemes do claim or do recognize the benefit that it has to them, both in terms of investor confidence and market support and consumer confidence as well. So that is an important thing to bear in mind when implementing a new scheme, for example, like Lebanon is thinking of, that the scheme is robust enough that consumers will be able to report their usage to those reporting standards, for example. So that's everything from me. I hope that was helpful. Please do feel free to contact me or to get in touch with REX International. And I look forward to the Q&A and to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Adam. I think Hassan and Shad, if it's okay, then I'll just start directly with my presentation as well. And to do that, I will, of course, share my presentation. Just one moment while I pull that up. Just pulling this up here. Can you please confirm that you see the presentation in front of you? Adam, or
yes.
any one of the
Yes,
presenters? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Adam, for the very valuable presentation and the overview of the European Guarantee of Origin market. I think it's really important that Adam started with a broad overview of EAC systems and also the European Guarantee of Origin market, because the EU GO market has had 20 years of development and growth. So it's really had 20 years to kind of improve, work out all of the various kinks that are in a system like this, and to grow to the more than 700 terawatt hours market that it is today. And it's really a well-defined and well-organized market, but even there are issues, and that's something that we'll talk about as well. And the IREC standard, of course, has been based heavily upon the European Guarantee of Origin system and the US REC system. And because our a voluntary standard, we are voluntary implemented by stakeholders, governments, or national authorities across the world, we have a bit more flexibility than, for example, the European Guarantee of Origin system or the US REC system to move quickly, because we often aren't as linked to national regulations or policies as the EU GO system is. So we'll talk about that in a little bit of detail during this presentation. So I think that it is important to recognize the kind of difference in the regulatory backing between these various systems. And while there are a number of benefits to being a heavily regulatory, system with quite a lot of policy and regulatory input, there's also a lot of downsides to that. And one of those downsides is, for example, in the European Guarantee of Origin system, while it's a benefit that is listed in European law, being listed in European law means that it can be quite slow and not always adapting to the market as a voluntary system would. And that's one of the concerns about being adherent to a standard like Sensenelec, for example. So there's a lot of benefits in allowing market development, because that's really what we're doing. We're creating a renewable electricity market to be as flexible and robust as possible, but still adherent to standards. And I think I just wanted to reflect on the slide that Adam presented as well, because there's a very important aspect that in all of the slides that Adam showed about the European Guarantee of Origin market or the US REC system or the IREC standard, is there's all of these organizations that were listed. And all of these organizations are really critical in the development of any energy attribute certificate system, because these organizations are the issuers. And the issuers we have to see as a kind of as the gatekeepers to the market. They are independent, neutral organizations that are appointed by governments or stakeholders or nonprofit organizations and standards together to really ensure that the market is reliable and robust, to make sure that double counting is avoided, to make sure that the standard is adhered to. Because once a certificate is issued into the market, you have essentially created a product. You've created for all intents and purposes, a commodity that can be traded, bought, and sold separate from the physical electricity. So verifying that that certificate has been issued into the market, has adhered to best practices, is indeed the mechanism that it says it is claiming to be, and also links directly to a specific megawatt hour that was produced from a specific device, is really important. And it shouldn't be underestimated the role of issuers in that regard. Now, Thomas Gosa is going to be on the call just after me. He's going to be presenting. He's now working with NEOM in Saudi Arabia, and of course he'll describe that in a bit more detail. But Thomas originally came from Dubai Carbon, where he was the issuer in the market. He was working for the independent issuer of the REC system, IREC system in the market in the UAE and in the Emirate of Dubai. So he's had a lot of experience on both sides of the spectrum, as a market facilitator, as a neutral independent party, but also as a market player, as someone that is not at all neutral and using the mechanisms there to facilitate and create revenue for renewable technologies. So focusing a little bit then on the system as a whole, we saw Adam present in a number of different ways the electricity system. And I want to show the electricity system and maybe the certificate system in a slightly different way, because you have attributes of a specific renewable technology, and attributes are anything from a wind turbine to the location, to the technology, to the owner, to the size, to the age. All these various aspects are seen as to be attributes. For our definitions here, an attribute is anything that is factual and can be independently verified by a third party. So that means if I were to send an auditor to a specific wind turbine, they would say, yes, this wind turbine is in this location, it is this size, it is owned by this organization, it produced that amount of electricity. It's all easily verifiable information. Those are all attributes. And those attributes create the basis of the issuance of the certificate. So the certificate is issued into a registry or trade platform, and it's done so by the issuer. Essentially, the issuer should actually be starting here on the left side, because they are the ones that are really creating the system from the ground up, allowing the issuance to take place. That trade and redemption is taking place. So the bidder that is willing to pay the most for those renewable attributes, of course, will trade and eventually redeem on their behalf. And then, of course, there will be end user claims. And these end user claims are, for example, I used renewable electricity. My products were created with renewable electricity. Our factory was powered by renewable electricity. So those claims are always linking back to the specific attribute. And it can be quite specific as well. It can be as much as our factory used renewable electricity that was produced within a 50-kilometer area from our point of consumption. So it can be as specific or as detailed as those organizations want. The most important aspect for us is that this is all adherent to standards. And that's why standards is building this from the ground up, because this is the role of the IREC standard, to create the best practices in place for market facilitators, who we'll talk about soon, to enable them to develop and create these markets from the ground up. And everyone recognizes and adheres to these standards. So really the issuer is quite important. And that's an aspect that I want to discuss in a little bit more detail later in the presentation. And the issuer, as we mentioned before in this slide, operates within a specific market boundary. So they are generally adherent to the national rules and regulations that adhere to a specific national electricity market. And as such, they are facilitating not only the adherence to the national rules and regulations, but also the voluntary rules of the IREC standard. Why did we create the IREC standard? So a little bit of history about the International REC standard is we recognized a few things. Voluntary market development leads to robust and reliable markets. And voluntary market development means producers and consumers voluntarily deciding to come together and support each other in either procuring or producing renewable electricity without necessarily the input of national governments. And the entire European market, for example, the 740 terawatt hours on an annual basis, is a voluntary market. There is no mandate from the national governments to procure renewable electricity. Consumers and producers get together on a voluntary basis to make those claims and to make those procurements possible. And those voluntary consumers are, large organizations, the very famous IT companies like Google or Apple or Amazon. It's production companies like Unilever or BMW or Mercedes. but it's also small to medium-sized enterprises and even household consumers. So in a country like the Netherlands, where the regulation is quite strong, in our house here in the Netherlands, we also consume renewable electricity, and that is guaranteed through the European Guarantee of Origin system and verified by the issuer, of course, and the market player that is supporting me in my household, because it's only a few geos a year, is my electricity supply company. So it can be consumers from the largest organizations in the world to the smallest organizations in the world. Two of the largest electricity consumers in the Netherlands, in the country where I live, consume combined about 3% of the total electricity in the Netherlands. And that is the Dutch railway providers, the Dutch train providers, and the second is the Dutch telecom providers. Each of them consume about 1.5% of the electricity, the total electricity in the Netherlands. They all voluntarily choose to procure renewable electricity through the Guarantee of Origin system, and as such support the development of renewable technologies in the country and in the broader market as well. So what we've seen is that voluntary markets involve the whole chain from producers to consumers, but also traders and suppliers and market players and other types of players as well. And voluntary markets show national governments a reasonable development path. That's a really important aspect, because when you have a functional market that supports the development of renewable technologies in the country with concrete financial investments made by voluntary consumers on a monthly or annual basis, governments see how they can then further develop and regulate these markets. And if a government has to build it from scratch, it's very, very challenging for a government to do that. And we see that over and over and over again. So it's our preference as the IREC standard to create voluntary markets and show national governments a reasonable development path for moving forward. It's not about reinventing the wheel. What we're trying to do is simplify the implementation of tracking systems as much as possible. So that's really part of the main goal that we have as the IREC standard and some of the history that we have learned over the years. So what did we learn from the markets that we're developing, the standards that we're developing? We recognize that when national governments and stakeholders and market parties decide to use a standard for the development of REC systems, like the International REC standard, we have a number of different benefits. The first benefit is that there's an increase in the use of an attribute tracking system by end users, which can increase demand-driven growth and possible foreign investment. Now, the reason for this is quite simple. You've got corporate companies that procure renewable electricity in 40, 50, 60 markets around the world. And they need to have an instrument that they understand and immediately recognize. And if they have to then get experts to understand the systems in Brazil and Chile and in the Congo and in Egypt and in Lebanon and in Turkey and in China and in Taiwan and in India, it can become very, very complex for them to procure renewable electricity. But if all these organizations and all these countries follow a standard, it's much easier for international end users and consumers to immediately recognize and procure renewable electricity. And that's why we say possibly foreign investment as well, because the easier it is to procure renewable electricity, the higher the investment in the local renewable technologies. The second and very highly connected aspect is that it simplifies the choice and trust consumers have when choosing renewables. Because if they need to review the legislation in each individual market, they need to create new contracts because there's a new legislative or regulatory structure. It becomes very challenging for consumers to make that choice, but also they've got less trust in the system, because if they're using a standard that they've used in 30 markets around the world, it's much easier for them to say, yes, we've done this 4, 5, 6 times already, so it's easy for us to do this in a new and different market, potentially like Lebanon down the road. The third is that it eliminates implementation problems when starting a new system, and this is really a critical aspect. We've seen governments try to introduce attribute tracking systems, but there's 1,000 different very tiny decisions that need to be made and need to be made correctly to create an effective market and an effective system. And we've recognized that by allowing the International REC standard that has proven effectiveness in more than 30 markets around the world, it can really eliminate the implementation problems when starting a new system. And that doesn't mean that the government shouldn't be involved down the line, because we do very much believe that governments need to be core in developing these systems long term. but that doesn't mean that they should be necessarily involved at the creation of a voluntary system from day one, because there are those implementation problems that could result. The fourth is that it can reduce or even completely eliminate the cost of implementing a REC system. Now, implementing a REC system doesn't have to be expensive. The IREC standard allows voluntary implementation at no cost. The costs eventually are borne by the producers of renewable technologies, who are eventually paid for their attributes by the end user. So in the end, the IREC standard has created a system that allows the end user, Google, Amazon, Apple, but also all the other organizations as well that consume renewable electricity, to bear the cost of developing that system, which is quite minimal. The difficulty is when a government develops the system not adherent to standards from day one, it can be very, very expensive, because they need to create the policy, they need to create the IT systems, they need to do everything from scratch instead of recreating a similar standard that has been used in different regions around the world. I'll give an example, for the Dutch electricity market, again, referencing the country where I'm currently calling from. The Dutch electricity market is organized by CEDRO. CEDRO is the issuer of guarantees of origin in the Netherlands, and they are a company held underneath the grid operator tenant. CEDRO has spent more than €1 million developing their registry system. And that is just expensive. And if they were to have worked with all the European governments around the world to create one single system, the cost of that system would have been reduced enormously. And that's what the IREC standard has been able to do. We've been able to have a high quality system that is extremely well organized, extremely well developed by the various market facilitators at an extremely low price to allow for that implementation to take place in various markets around the world. And the last is, because it's a standardized system, it allows for a simplified development path for stakeholders to join the developments. And essentially, you have environmental labels, you have various types of industry organizations, NGOs, that all then recognize the system that is being used and can implement their mechanism on top of that quite easily. And in particular for environmental labels, eco labels. This is the IREC standard as a whole, and I don't want to overly complicate the discussion. So what I'm going to do is talk about it in phases. The first phase, the second phase, and the third phase, or essentially the portions of the IREC standard, because I think it's good that people understand the details of where different organizations fall and what role they have in the development of a reliable attribute tracking system. So the first is market players, and we'll talk about that in more detail. But market players are essentially anyone that is using the market that is being created. The second is market facilitators. Market facilitators are the organizations that are allowing for the market to take place. They are facilitating the creation of the market and essentially providing that for various market players. And the third is the standard setting body. That's the IREC standard, the board, the secretariat, and of course, stakeholders are involved there as well. And this is quite similar to any other regulatory system that you would have. Even in Europe as well, you have market players that are using the system. You have facilitators like the issuers that I mentioned before, and you have the standard setting bodies, who are the Association of Issuing Bodies, which is a voluntary standard setting organization, and the national governments. So this is a very common methodology for doing this, but this is how it's been described within the IREC standard. So if you look from the ground up, we're going to first talk about this first portion, which is market players. We'll speak about the beneficiaries. The beneficiaries are quite literally the end users of electricity. This is, as you see in the slides, the large companies that we're familiar with, but also small to medium-sized enterprises that are interested in procuring renewable electricity or procuring a specific type of electricity product. And beneficiaries are supported by participants. Participants are essentially electricity traders, market brokers, individual end users, electricity producers, or others. You could call a participant by any other word, a market player, a trader, a broker, these different types of terminologies. A registrant is quite similar. They're on the other side of the coin, and that is electricity traders, market brokers, electricity producers. But essentially, a registrant is representing the facility owner, the electricity generator. And this goes very much to the type of slide that you saw from Adam, where you have essentially the generators on one side and the consumers on the other side, separated by the net. And the electricity system and certificate systems are very similar in that regard. So you have generators that are supported by market players and traders that are eventually trading these technologies, trading these assets to different types of organizations, and they're being redeemed on behalf of end users or specific beneficiaries. So this is the area of market players. From there, we're going to talk a little bit about market facilitators. So those that are creating the market for the device owners and the eventual end users. There you've got what we term code managers. These are organizations like governments or nonprofit organizations or private companies or independent organizations that adhere rules that are adherent to the IREC standard that facilitate the market. So it could be any organization. If a government says, listen, we want to adhere to the IREC standard, we're going to become a code manager and facilitate the market, that is possible. It could also be, for example, private companies as well. In all cases, the code manager needs to work with a registry operator. And the registry operator is the organization that quite literally has an online database of all the RECs that are issued, redeemed, traded, and they make a registry of who owns a specific attribute at what time. And the registry, of course, is a relatively complex piece of IT equipment, and it needs to be very secure. So that's a specific aspect that is often done by well-known kind of IT providers in this space. The next is the issuer, and this is what I've mentioned before. The issuer is an independent market operator. They are a responsive market operator for the market as well, because the issuer is really the operator that controls what certificates go into the market. The issuer is issuing certificates to the registrant here below. And that is either a government, a nonprofit organization, an industry organization, or a private company. The issuer can be any organization that is reliable, independent, and robust. So it can really be, like is the case in Abu Dhabi, we're working with the Abu Dhabi Ministry of Energy to become the issuer. But in Dubai, there's a nonprofit organization, that's the Dubai Carbon Center of Excellence. We have industry organizations or electricity market operators like in Singapore, who's SP Group, for example, who is the electricity market operator in Singapore as the issuer, or in Thailand, where it is EGAT, the Electricity Generation Authority of Thailand. But we also have private organizations and nonprofit organizations that operate as issuer as well. So the most important criteria of an issuer is that they are independent, they are responsive, and they are a neutral operator of the market. The next two aspects of market facilitation are dashed because they're optional. They aren't required for the facilitation of a reliable market, but they are seen as beneficial elements. And the first is a labeling authority and the label. So these are environmental labels that say that a specific technology is sustainable or robust or has additional benefits outside of what is being prepared within the standard itself. So they could say, this is, in our opinion, a sustainable technology, or this is, in our opinion, an additional technology. So these are the labels that we see quite often in the market. And the last, and apologies for it being a bit dark, but is the platform operator. And a platform is essentially an organization that allows for information on the database to be either visualized in a different manner, bought and sold in a different manner, traded or cleared, or all these different types of mechanisms are what a platform operator can organize. But again, a market facilitator needs to be independent. So the platform operator also needs to be an independent operator of the market. They need to allow for buying and selling in a specific way that doesn't favor a specific market player. And the last is the standard setting body. This is the IREC standard, of course, as an organization. It's a nonprofit organization. We have a list of rules and regulations called the IREC standard that I would encourage anyone to look at as well. We have an independent board with an independent secretariat, and obviously we work with stakeholders quite a lot to make sure that things are organized and in line with international best practices. And the IREC standard is facilitating the general rules and regulations that are used by the below market facilitators, the code manager, the issuer, the registry, the platform operator, and the labels. And eventually those market facilitation tools are being used by the market players that are buying, selling, and trading renewable electricity. So it is a very well-defined and contractually secure mechanism for allowing end users, the eventual beneficiary here at the bottom right, to claim renewable electricity. So that was just a general introduction to the IREC standard. Obviously, I'm here for questions at the end. I'd be happy to take those, and please feel free to ask questions as well in the text box, and I'll try and respond to those as well. And please feel free to reach out to me through the email below or by going to the website, www.irecstandard.org. Thanks so much. And Thomas, I'll hand the floor, the presentation floor to you.
Thanks a lot, Jared. Yeah, please raise your hand and let me know if you hear me. We've been facing some issues with Zoom the last weeks, but I hope it's going to work out just
we hear you.
Excellent. Perfect. Good. Okay. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation for this session. Thank you also to the speakers before me. But I'll give a quick run through the IRECs in the Middle Eastern region. Like Jared said before, I've been basically working on both sides. Initially, I've started with the Dubai Carbon Center as the local issuer, and now I'm more on the participation side, looking for IRECs and trying to get in the market here. Let me start a little bit earlier also to maybe reason up towards the end of the presentation. And no, it may always get a little bit difficult as the last speaker. So look, I had the first, when I first heard about renewable energy certificates, it was back in 2015. And we were just about to register Dubai's largest solar project at that time under the UN-backed Clean Development Mechanism framework to certify the carbon credits. I got a message on Twitter back then about the first IREC project that has been registered in Vietnam. And I didn't even bother to find additional information for these IRECs, but instead just took the phone and called Kyoto Energy at the time and basically just cornered them. And I knew Michael from before. We've been working together in the Vietnamese market on hydro projects, on solar projects and so forth. And he was basically the one who contracted all these projects where we were a little bit, wasn't so easy for us at that time. I was working in Denmark and they basically raised the market there. Anyhow, my thought was to, let's find out what this IREX is all about. And when Kyoto Energy is doing it, it must be successful. Yeah. So I called him, we chatted a bit. He filled me into the concept and then started basically saying like, look, you must have a good potential in the Middle East as well. And then when I realized, maybe we should stop talking now and let me look into it and set it up myself to make sure that we actually get some good projects up there. Not everything is going to Kyoto Energy and Mika. Anyway, so my name is Thomas Gosa. I'm currently holding the position as certificate manager at NEOM, where I'm responsible for developing and operating a carbon management framework to achieve carbon neutral position as key enabler for NEOM's circular carbon economy. IREX, amongst other offsets mechanism, will be a central cornerstone in the energy market and business model design to achieve our vision. And prior to that, I was heading the programs department at the Dubai Carbon Center of Excellence in Dubai, a Dubai-based boutique advisory firm that was working in the realms of strategic consultancy and so forth. More importantly here to note is that Dubai Carbon Center of Excellence is the local issuer for IREX in the UAE and also its neighboring countries. So as discussed and outlined in the previous presentations, the IREC concept is that for each megawatt hour of renewable energy produced, a tradable certificate is issued to the generator, who can then sell this IREC in the marketplace. The IREC market can be geared specifically towards encouraging growth in a particular type of renewable energy, such as solar or wind. And while the cap and trade schemes for the carbon emissions have gained widespread attention as market-based tools in the past, the IREC is an alternative approach which is now growing rapidly in many regions, especially also here in the Middle East. So I will go not too much into technical details on IREC because that has been basically described and discussed in the previous presentation, but in eligible under IRECs in the Middle East. Jared, correct me if I'm wrong there. So it's the UAE, it's Morocco, Jordan, KSA, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Egypt, which I haven't included in the slide here. The number of devices that are expected to be registered within this year will more than double to what has been registered as of 2020. I would say Morocco probably spearheads the renewable energy market in the Arab world with around 3.6 gigawatt of renewable energy projects under the development, and we'll probably see a lot more registrations and transactions in the near future. Saudi Arabia has just completed their first 2 utility-scale renewable energy projects that will undergo IREC registration in the next couple of months. The UAE was one of the first IREC eligible countries within the region. Here, Dubai Carbon back in 2016 decided to take on the role as local issuer and develop IREC market in the UAE. As it saw the IREC concept clearly supporting national clean energy frameworks and strategies with the aim to achieve a certain renewable energy mix within the grid over a relevant timeline. The UAE Strategy 2050 for energy on a federal level aims to increase the contribution of clean energy in the total energy mix from 25% to 50% by 2050. And the Dubai Clean Energy Strategy aims to provide 7% of Dubai's energy from clean energy sources by 2020. It will increase the targets to 25% by 30 and then 75% by 2050. And here the RECs, renewable energy certificates, in this case the IRECs, help attain the 5 main pillars of the Dubai Clean Energy Strategy by greening the grid. And also, on the other hand, can be seen as incentives to develop renewable energy projects. And what is really nice to see is also there is that the focus was not so much only on the utility scale projects, so the larger solar installations, but also really a move, at least on a conceptual stage, towards distributed solar and finding a way of how on a programmatic approach and program level these installations can be pooled into portfolios and then registered with the IREC standard. So back in 2017, the Dubai-based electricity and water utility DEWA became the first entity in the MENA region to generate and issue IRECs, with the first IREC project being the 13 megawatt phase 1 of the Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum solar park initiatives. The project is generating around 25,000 IRECs every year, and with that really support DEWA's commitment into the environment and its adherence to increase the share of clean energy in the energy mix. As off-taker, there was Philips Lighting on the other side, one of the influential companies that are committed to 100% renewable power. And they used the IRECs really for their regional office in Dubai to meet its ambitious CSR target. So the potential for renewable energy in the region at record levels of low cost of energy is remarkable. And we can really, have a look at all these different countries, whether it's Egypt, the UAE, Jordan, Morocco, Oman, or Saudi Arabia. It's really a growing market. The energy and clean energy strategies are being implemented in many countries in the region, and in some cases it's really capacity-wise they are tenfold between 2020 and 2030. So what is expected to really go online in terms of their capacities? The focus will be on wind and solar PV, where in some countries also the concentrated solar power, the CSP, is expected to have a certain market share as well. Towards the end, what I wanted to do is to give you a little bit of insights also in terms of NEOM itself, and how we basically fractured the whole situation within NEOM itself. NEOM is a city-state within Saudi Arabia that borders with Egypt and Jordan, and it's a development that started about 1 or 2 years ago and is expected to be completed by 2030. Yeah, you may have come across some of the recent announcements. The latest one last week about the line which will stretch across the region with city clusters that are developed using state-of-the-art technologies while appreciating what the nature can give at the same time. Yeah, so we are looking here in our developments at a very holistic, sustainable, and very carbon-sensitive view. So now, in order to meet the ultimate goal of carbon neutrality, we have established a carbon management framework as a key enabler for NEOM's carbon circular economy. And this involves the development of a greenhouse gas inventory, setting carbon abatement targets, looking into carbon abatement initiatives that can generate market-based certificates, such as carbon offsets, but also renewable energy certificates and other green gas certificates from green ammonia, green hydrogen, and so forth. We will need to look into external offsets procurement as well, especially over the upcoming years when development and construction takes place. Yeah, here renewable energy certificates will play a key role as temporary connections to the Saudi Arabian grid are unavoidable on such a scale. Yeah, and what is important to note here is that NEOM will move from being on an offtake side with demand for renewable energy certificates in the initial years to a potential supplier of these certificates. Yeah, and that really is in line with our approach and our need to set up our own renewable energy assets. So it's really something where, you know, in the first years, we may participate in the market more on the offtake side. So we will buy certificates, where later, once everything is up and running, we will give back. You know, we will be able to supply renewable energy into the Saudi grid. There are discussions also to connect with Egypt and some of the neighboring countries to really help these countries with their requirements as well. Yeah. So. And then, yeah, one of the last parts of it, last but not least, communicating this journey to the public with all its challenges and achievements will play a key role also when we go through these different parts of development. I wanted to use the last as a little excursion as to the means to present what our plans with NEOM are, but also to testing the grounds, you know, for new innovations and so forth. And this being said, I will now come to my last slide to bring you back to some of the lessons learned as well as challenges faced. Some of them were not so much of a concern being a local issuer, to be honest. But now being a participant, it actually makes very much sense. It's a very important thing when really being in the market and see how to link, especially when talking about different certification schemes. Yeah. So it's worth mentioning that many of these points are being or have been addressed by the IREX standard already. I would say one of the main things we had in the beginning phases when we tried to promote IREX, especially in the UAE, was really the lack of trust of entities in new market mechanisms. Yeah, many of these entities have focused or have developed CDM projects, carbon credit projects, and were badly hit by market changes, price changes, and so forth. So for us to come in, even with potential off-takers, and try to convince now project owners, proponents to register their devices with the market, with the IREC standard, was not very easy, especially in the beginning. Yeah. So that was something what really took some time to gain this trust of stakeholders again in new mechanisms there. Another point was the unawareness or the misunderstanding of IREC versus carbon offsets, right? So on one hand, we are talking about we are reducing carbon by renewable energy, but here then to claim that the renewable energy is actually a claim on green electricity. So that also really was something what took a lot of, you know, back and forth, a lot of awareness sessions and convincing also to make, you know, this in IREC is actually not a carbon offset, you know. At a later stage, I see also with the IREC standard that there's now also the link much clearer. So there's the tag on, you know, if you actually have a claim on the green electricity, that may actually extend also to the carbon, yeah, and the carbon reduction of that megawatt hour. Yeah. One of the other points we are especially now also dealing with is the concept of additionality. Yeah, the effect of a project activity to reduce greenhouse gases to levels that would have occurred in the absence of the project. And that same or to similar means also it applies somehow to the IRECs. Yeah, so do I purchase an IREC from an existing project or from a project that is being developed for a specific purpose for the needs of what I need the IREC for? Yeah, that becomes very crucial when you talk about, you know, the usage of an IREC. You know, when it's for voluntary use for CSR purpose to green a percentage of your electricity consumption, that is one thing. But the second, you actually interlink certification schemes, one of them being green hydrogen, green ammonia, right? And you are using a part for the electrolyzer in the beginning that you're connected to the grid, you need to have green electricity, then suddenly additionality plays a big role and is widely discussed now within these schemes as well. Yeah, the next thing is the geographical concurrency and cross-border trades. Yeah, I think it was mentioned already a bit earlier that there is a move obviously towards using IRECs that are locally generated. Yeah, so not going to another country and actually take these IRECs in there. Yeah, again, something which is now becoming extremely important when we look into linked certification schemes like green hydrogen, yeah, where it is very clear it needs to be something which is in the geographical boundary. Yeah, one of the last thing I want to mention is the temporal concurrency. Yeah, the question is, so I generate an IREC now. When do I redeem it? Yeah? Do I redeem it now? Do I redeem it next year? Yeah, and there are also now discussions where these time tags, yeah, of IRECs become very, very in a very short time period. Let's put it like that. So this is something what is now being addressed also in terms of how we as NEOM really want to deal with it during the next years. You know, where we essentially are off-takers for renewable energy certificates. Yeah? So we can't shy away, and we want to do this in a very transparent manner. So what we are looking at, whether that's domestically in Saudi Arabia with some of our partners and entities which are developing these renewable energy projects, and to basically promote this IREC so that we can source locally and then at a later stage give it back to Saudi Arabia, or whether we really look also what is happening in our neighboring country and then find transparent ways and ways which would not have a hit on our, you know, our vision in the end to move accordingly. That is all from my end for the presentation. Thank you very much. And yeah, if there are any questions, I'm happy to address them.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and everyone from the panelists who gave very interesting presentation and very clear presentations. So thank you very much. And for the attenders, I want to thank you for sticking with us for 1 hour and 15 minutes. We still have one question on the chat box, which is more related to CEDRO 5 by an anonymous attendee. We can discuss how ESCOs can participate in CEDRO 5. If you can give us your email or your name, and we can discuss this separately. We will be sending after this webinar the report that was developed by IREC for the understanding of the REC scheme and a roadmap, potential roadmaps for Lebanon. We will also be continuing our collaboration with IREC and the Ministry of Energy and Water to set up the energy certificate scheme in Lebanon, which will include also designating and identifying local issuers, among other things. We will also send you the presentations that were presented today in the webinar. And I want to thank everyone who attended and everyone who gave the presentations, and thank you very much. There's also Rabia Mdawar, who is asking, is there any work in Lebanon for mandatory reporting of GHG, greenhouse gas emissions for organization above a certain scale? I'm not sure I have fully understood the question.
Jad, can Vahakin speak on to answer this question? Is Vahakin with us, or he left? He left.
So Vahakin is the project manager of the climate change project at the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Environment, but he left.
But I think the answer is no. There's nothing mandates a company of any size to report its greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. I don't know if Jared wants to answer.
And I'd like to mention as well that this is quite common as well. So I don't know of any country right now where it is mandatory at an organizational level, at the end user level, to report greenhouse gas emissions at the point of consumption. So of course you have some cap and trade mechanisms or these different types of aspects for large industrial organizations, but that's not necessarily a mandatory reporting in that degree. And maybe Adam has some other thoughts there, or Thomas as well. But to the best of my knowledge, the kind of environmental reporting of a greenhouse gas emissions at an organizational level is not mandated yet anywhere that I know of.
Yeah, what I could maybe quickly add, I agree with that. In Dubai, what it is, it's on the government level. There is a mandate that these has to be reported and captured. So that's not their organizational levels, but governmental entities have to report on that. It's not publicly, but that goes to the executive committee.
But there's also one other question in the box. Maybe we can address that one. And Adam, I think you can probably answer it likely the best, but it's related to EDL, who is the grid operator. They were asking that because all consumers collectively using power from all production sites connected to the grid, thus consumers would be using the same percentage of renewables as EDL supplies, the grid operator supplies. So a bit about consumer choice in the electricity market. Do you mind if I give you an opportunity to respond there?
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, thanks for passing the question over to me. So this would be the situation if there was either no tracked energy or there was what we call the residual mix. So if there's no tracked energy, then indeed all consumers are using would be able to claim the kind of the grid mix of electricity, which is just a mix of power that's put onto the grid and it isn't tracked and so is available to everyone. When you have a certification system, then particular units of energy have particular attributes linked to them. And if they are bought by particular consumers, then they're taken out of the grid mix, and you are left with what's called the residual mix, which is the grid mix minus the attributes of the energy units which have been certified and the certificates have been cancelled. So this is why a tracking system is very important, because if there are consumers in Lebanon who particularly want to consume renewable energy, they can do that through a tracking scheme. They will pay a value for that, which will then go back to the generators and encourage generation of more renewable energy. And then all of the remaining consumers who don't take an active choice to buy renewables by cancelling certificates, they'll be left with what is the residual mix, which is the grid mix, as I said, minus the attributes that have been certified and cancelled. I hope that's clear for everybody.
And maybe just one aspect, looking at the IREC standard as well, is that one thing that we have to recognize is before a tracking system is in place, essentially the attributes are a public good, you could say in many ways. They are delivered to the grid, and they are delivered to every user of that grid in the exact same way, because there's no way to track ownership from the generation to the end user. But essentially, the introduction of a tracking system is also the introduction, you could say, of privatization of various types of attributes on the grid. And this comes with a number of benefits, of course, that individual organizations are willing to pay a higher value for the specific attributes that were otherwise lost to the grid, you could say, and lost to all various end users. But there's also potentially a downside as well in the fact that the average user of the grid is allowed to claim a lower portion of renewable electricity. And this is what Adam was mentioning with the residual mix. So there is a positive and a negative to essentially commoditizing or privatizing the individual attributes of renewable energy generation. And of course, the benefit is more revenue to the renewables generators. The downside is the loss of renewable claims by the average consumer of the grid.
Which should, of course, motivate average consumers to join those who are buying renewables and funnel that income to renewables generators and drive the transition that way is how I would also view it. But I agree with your comment, Jared. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's it, right, Jad? No more questions. Jad?
Yes, true. We answered most of the questions. I think
okay.
There's nothing else. We can end the session, and we will share with you all the materials that were shared and all the contact information of all the panelists, and you can reach out to them separately if you have more questions or more suggestions and comments about implementing the IREC scheme in Lebanon. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you,
Jared,
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for the
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.